The morning my father drove away, the sky was the color of old pewter, and the grass was still brown from winter. He did not look back. I remember that plainly, the wagon seat, his shoulders squared against the wind, the two mules pulling east across the flat, and not once a turn of his head. My stepmother sat beside him with her hands folded in her lap, and the wagon creaked over the rise until it was a small thing, and then nothing. And then there was only the wind and the 60 acres of Hayes County, Nebraska territory, and me. It was the 3rd of April, 1883. I was 16 years old. I did not know it yet, but I had been given the only inheritance that would ever matter to me, and it had not come from my father at all. It had come from a woman already 2 months in the ground. They called what I built the girl's grave. That is the truth of how this story was named by the people around me. And I tell you now only that it did not fail. If you want to understand why it did not, and why the thing I buried in a hillside on the edge of nowhere outlasted every frame house in 3 townships, then you will need to stay a while. What I did not yet understand, that April morning with the wagon gone and the wind pulling at my coat, was that the ground beneath my feet was not a punishment. It was a lesson waiting to be read. I will tell you how I learned to read it. My grandmother's name was Hetty Strand. She came from a coastal village in Norway when she was 14, and she carried in her hands the memory of a way of building that her own people had used before they crossed an ocean and forgot most of what they knew. She settled in eastern Nebraska with my grandfather, and they built the usual claim shanty, and when that blew down, they built a better one. And when my grandfather died, she moved south to live with us on our claim in Hayes County. And she taught me things, not by sitting me down with a lesson, by working beside me, handing me the shovel, showing me the angle of a cut before she named it. She was a short woman with square hands and gray eyes, and she smelled of wood smoke and dried grass. And she died the 2nd week of February, 1882, in her sleep, while the temperature outside was 23 below zero. She was comfortable, is the point. She was warm in that house she had insisted on building a particular way, and she died easy. And I was 15 years old, and I didn't yet understand why the cold had not taken her the way it took others. But I remembered everything she had shown me. My hands remembered it before my mind did. She left me a tin box, not money, not land. A tin box with the lid bent and the latch stiff from years of handling, and inside it a dozen sheets of paper, some in her handwriting, some in my grandfather's, and some in a language I could read only in pieces. Drawings of walls in cross-section, notations about angle and depth, a sketch of a hillside with a small rectangle cut into it at a measured slope. The word she wrote beside that sketch, in her careful English, was breathing. She had drawn an arrow pointing at the space between 2 lines of the wall, and she had written breathing there. And then beneath it, in her own Norwegian, she had written a phrase I sounded out over months until I understood it to mean something close to this. The cold cannot pass through what it cannot find. I kept that box. When my father packed the wagon in late March of 1883 and told me that he and my stepmother were relocating to join her sister's people in Missouri, and that the 60 acres were mine to prove up or surrender as I saw fit, and that I was old enough to manage, I kept the tin box. I kept it in the pocket of my coat when the wagon drove east. I held it in both hands after the wagon crested the rise and disappeared. I was not thinking yet about building. I was thinking about how to feed myself through the summer and whether I could get a garden in before the last frost. But the box was in my pocket, and Gran Hetty's drawings were inside it. And what I did not yet understand was that the ground itself was about to become everything. The 60 acres sat at the edge of a long, shallow rise, the kind the territory made in abundance, and at the back of the property the rise became something almost worth calling a hill, south-facing, with a cut in it where water had run off over generations and left a natural shelter of earth. I had passed it 100 times without seeing what it was. Gran Hetty had seen it. She had walked me to it one autumn afternoon and stood with her hand on my shoulder and said nothing, only looked, and then walked back to the house. I had thought nothing of it then. I thought of it in April, standing alone in the wind, and I walked to the base of that cut and looked at the angle of slope and felt in my chest something I could not name yet, a kind of rightness, the way a tool sits in the hand when the balance is correct. I began digging on the 7th of April, 1883. My dog, Fern, was with me, a brown hound of no certain breed, with a broad forehead and ears that folded once, and she sat at the edge of the cut and watched me swing the mattock and did not understand what I was doing. Neither did anyone else. The ground at the base of the cut was clay and loam, good weight-bearing ground, the kind that does not shift when it dries. I had watched Gran Hetty test ground by wetting a handful and pressing it into a cylinder between her palms, and I did that before I cut the first angle, and the cylinder held its shape without crumbling, which was what she had said to look for. The cut went in at a gentle downward slope, following the natural fall of the hillside, and after the first 10 feet the earth above me was already at shoulder height. I was not digging a cellar in the way the territory understood cellars, straight down and square. I was following the hill's own logic, cutting into it the way you open a letter rather than the way you dig a grave, at an angle that would let the south light come through the entrance in the low winter months, would let the rain drain away from the opening rather than into it, and would give the room above it a depth of earth that could be planted and rooted before the first hard frost. The neighbors who came by in May and June saw a young woman digging alone into a hillside, and they saw it without the context of Gran Hetty's cross-section drawings, or her quiet instruction about which direction the winter sun traveled, or why the distance between two walls mattered as much as the thickness of one. They saw a hole. They saw eccentric grief, a girl left behind acting out her trouble in clay and sweat, and they were not unkind in their assessment, only certain of it, and certainty in the territory had a way of becoming landscape before anyone thought to question it. Guard Holt saw the beginnings of it in early May, when I walked into Dunham's supply store for seed and twine. He was a tall man with a red face and a habit of standing with both thumbs in his suspenders, and he kept a kind of permanent residence on the bench outside Dunham's, and he had opinions about everything the territory produced. He looked at the clay on my boots and said, in a mild and friendly voice, that he had heard I was digging myself a hole out on the Strand claim. I said I was building a house. He tilted his head. "A house in the ground," he said. He said it the way a man says a thing that does not require a response, and the two men beside him on that bench smiled, and one of them said, "Well, that is one way to do it." Guard said, "She's building a girl's hole." He did not mean it hard. He meant it the way the territory meant most things, plain and without ceremony, and the name fastened like a seed in dry ground, and it grew. I did not answer him. I bought my seed and my twine, and I went back to my digging, and I opened the tin box that night by lamplight, and I smoothed Gran Hetty's papers on the floor of my tent, and I looked again at the cross-section drawing of the walls. 2 lines close together, an arrow pointing to the space between them, the word breathing. I had been cutting the hillside at a south-facing angle, 7 degrees off true south, which was the angle Gran Hetty had drawn in her sketch, and I had been thinking about why. The sun. In the deep of winter, the sun stays low, and a south-facing slope catches it from morning to late afternoon, and stone and packed earth absorb that heat, and give it back slowly through the night. I knew that much from watching her, from the way she had always positioned a cold frame or a root cellar. What I hadn't yet fully worked out was the wall. The wall came to me in stages, the way her lessons always had. Gran Hetty did not explain first and demonstrate second. She demonstrated and let the explanation catch up. I had watched her, years before, stuff the space between two boards with dried grass before nailing the outer skin of the wall. And I had asked her why, and she had pressed my hand flat against the inner wall surface and then against the outer and said, "Feel the difference." There was a difference, even in summer. The inside surface was a degree or two cooler than the outside. She said the grass does not let the heat make up its mind about which side to belong to. I had been 11 years old, and I had laughed at her phrasing. Now I was 16 and standing alone in front of a hill, and the laugh was a long way away, and I understood what she had meant with my whole body. 2 walls of sod, each cut to 12 inches, set with a 4-inch gap between them. The gap packed with dried prairie grass, pressed in tight so no wind could pull it through. The outer wall would take the cold. The inner wall would hold the warmth. The cold would reach the grass and lose itself there, because grass is not a solid thing and cold moves through solids, and the air trapped in grass is different from the air outside. And between the two conditions, the cold would spend itself before it found the room. Gran Hetty had not called it insulation. She had called it the breathing wall, and the word was better. By July of 1883, the main room was cut, and the walls were going up, and the structure was visible enough that a person passing on the road could see what I was doing. What I was doing did not look like any house they had seen. It looked, from the road, like a woman digging herself into a hillside. The neighbors came by in 2s and 3s, not to help but to look, and they stood at a distance of 20 or 30 yards and watched and talked among themselves and eventually moved on. Fern watched them from the entrance to the cut, sitting in the shade I had not yet roofed, with her ears forward and her tail still. I was making hay that August, cutting the long grass in the low places and stacking it near the entrance to the cut. And Delia Marsh came down from her family's claim, a quarter-mile north to watch. She was 12 years old, small for it, with her hair in a thick brown braid, and she arrived with bread wrapped in cloth and sat on a stone and offered me some without ceremony. I ate it. She said, "What is the grass for?" I said, "For the walls." She looked at the stacked hay and looked at the walls going up in the cut and said, "Inside the walls." I said yes. She said that was a strange way to do it. I said my grandmother had done it this way. Delia nodded as if that settled it, and after a while she picked up a pitchfork and helped me turn the stack. And she came back 3 more times that month to help. And she never again said it was strange. The sod itself came from the flats east of the hill, cut in blocks 12 inches wide and 3 inches thick. The grass roots still bound through the block and holding it together the way bones hold a body. Gran Hetty had shown me how to cut sod that would not crack at its edges, a shallow angle on the spade rather than a straight downward cut, and how to stack it flat so the weight of the blocks above pressed the grass roots deeper into the earth below, and the whole course bonded itself as it settled. I laid the outer course first, working from the base of the room upward, and then I laid the inner course alongside it with the 4-inch gap between them. And I tamped dried grass into that gap in the evenings when Fern sat beside me on the packed floor and watched, and I packed it tight enough that no wind could draw through it, and loose enough that the structure of the grass itself, the millions of small air pockets between the dried stems, could do what Gran Hetty had said it would do. The grass does not let the heat make up its mind about which side to belong to. packed tight in the gap between two courses of sod. It did not let the cold make up its mind either. And that was the point. And the feeling of it coming right was not a thought, but a physical thing. A settling in the chest the way a door settles into a true-cut frame. I want to be honest about that summer because there are parts of it worth knowing, and they do not belong to the story of the house. They belong to being 16 and alone, and not yet certain that what you are doing makes sense. I lay on my back some nights in my tent and listened to Fern breathe, and thought about my father's shoulders on the wagon seat, and felt the absence of everything I had expected to have. And there was a kind of cold in that which had nothing to do with temperature, a drafty thing that moved through the middle of the chest when the wind turned. I did not dwell on it. I had my grandmother's tin box and her papers and the hill taking shape in front of me, and dwelling would not frame a wall or pack a gap with grass. What I kept instead was a habit of going back to the drawings whenever I felt uncertain. Her handwriting steadied me, the angle of her lines. What she had seen in that hillside and drawn down on paper for someone to find, the way you leave a lamp in a window. There were mornings in July when I was so stiff in the hands from cutting sod that I could not close them into a fist until after breakfast, and I would sit outside the entrance to the cut in the early light, eating cold cornbread and working my fingers open and shut while Fern nosed the grass at the edge of the hill. And I would think about Gran Hetty's hands, which had been square and cracked at every knuckle from a lifetime of exactly this kind of work. And I would think that her hands had taught mine, and that there was a line of instruction in that which no dispossession could interrupt. That what my father had left me on that April road was not nothing but the field itself, and the hill, and the 60 acres of ground my grandmother had already walked, and already read, and already drawn in cross-section, and left me the key to. That is not what it felt like in the moment. In the moment it felt like hard and lonely work in a hot summer. But that is what it was. The frame for the roof went up in September, when the grass began to dry, and the first cool nights reminded the territory that winter had not gone far. I want to tell you what that roof was, because it is the part that puzzled people most, and the part that mattered most when the time came to matter. Gran Hetty's sketch showed 3 layers over the frame. First, a laid course of sod, grass side down. Second, a deep packing of the driest prairie grass I could cut and stack, as thick as I could make it without collapsing the frame, which I had built heavier than a standard root cellar for this reason. Third, another course of sod over the top of the grass side up this time, so it would catch moisture and hold it and not blow away. And over all of it, once the sod had settled, 2 feet of packed earth and clay, mounded at the ridge so the water would run to the sides. The total depth from the room's ceiling to the surface of the mound was nearly 3 feet of layered material, and not 1 inch of it was uniform, and that was the point. Uniform material conducts. Layered material of different densities interrupts. The cold would reach the earth and slow. It would reach the grass and stop. What arrived in the room would be no worse than cool, even when the world above was trying to kill a thing. I finished the roof in the first week of October and moved in by the middle of the month, and Fern moved in with me, and I kept the tin box on the shelf above the south window where the light could find it. The town's opinion of all this had been solidifying since July, the way opinion does, quietly and without requiring new information. Guard Holt put it plainly at the Harvest Social that October, in the churchyard south of Dunham's store, with perhaps 30 people standing in the last warm evening of the year. He said, loud enough and not unkindly, that the Strand girl had finished burying herself. He said she had built what he would call a girl's grave if anyone asked his opinion. and that while he wished her no harm, he expected she would be cold as charity by February. Rue Olsen, the Norwegian widow who farmed a claim east of mine, said in a careful voice that earth houses had kept people warm a long way back, and that the Strand girl might know something worth knowing. Gard smiled at her and said that was a very Norwegian thing to say, and the laughter that followed was not cruel, but it was complete, and Rue did not say more, and I stood at the edge of the gathering with a cup of cider and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the winter would not say for me. If you have stayed with me this far, I want to ask something of you. Not much, only this. If you have ever built a thing that others called a folly, or known a thing that others called foolishness, stay close. What happened that winter is why I'm still telling this story, and I am not done yet. It was that same autumn that a land surveyor named Ward came through Hayes County on behalf of the Territorial Homestead Office, recording structures and improvements. He rode his horse to the base of my hill and looked at the mounded roof with its green fringe of grass still showing at the edges, and he pulled out his ledger and wrote something, and then looked up at me and said, "Is that the dwelling?" I said it was. He looked at it a moment longer and said, "What is the roof depth?" I told him 3 feet of layered material, sod and grass and earth. He wrote that down too, taking his time, and then he asked me who had taught me the method. I told him my grandmother. He looked at the hill one more time with an expression I could not fully read, something between professional interest and plain surprise, and then he closed his ledger and rode on. I did not think about him again for 2 years, but I have thought about that look many times since. He was a man whose work was to record what existed in the territory, and what he had found at the base of my hill was something he did not have a category for yet. The winter of 1883 and 4 was cold but ordinary, and the structure performed as I expected, which is to say the room held between 40 and 50 degrees through January without a fire, and between 60 and 70 with one, and I burned less than a third of the wood my neighbors burned in their frame houses, and was warmer than most of them. This was not vindication. It was a quiet fact, the way most true things are quiet, before someone else needs them. Fern slept curled at the foot of the stone bench on the coldest nights, and she was warm, and I was warm, and outside the wind pushed across the territory with the same indifference it brought to everything. And inside the hill the air was the same air I had packed grass around in August, and it had not changed its mind about its temperature, the way the air in a frame house changes its mind the moment the fire goes down. I added a small second room in the spring of 1884, cutting deeper into the hillside along the same angle, and I packed the new walls the same way, and I added a brace of ventilation notches near the rear of the roof that Gran Hetty had noted in her drawings as necessary, for the air not to go stale. In the summer of '85, I dug a small cold cellar off the main room and lined it with stone, and it held ice through August. Delia Marsh helped me with the stonework, older now, taller, with a facility for lifting that surprised her own father when he came to look. She asked good questions about the wall packing, and I answered them as directly as Gran Hetty had answered mine, which is to say with the work rather than with words. Gard Holt came by in the summer of '86 with 2 other men whose names I will not repeat, and stood outside the entrance to the hill and looked at the structure with the expression of a man trying to find a fault he cannot locate. He said, "The girl's grave keeps growing." He said it with something in his voice that was not entirely contempt, something closer to puzzlement. But the name came out the same way it always had, easy and flat, and I understood that he was not changing his mind, only looking at new evidence through the same glass. It was Rue Olsen who told me in the late summer of '87, that the autumn felt wrong to her. She had come to return a borrowed pot, and she stood outside in the failing light and held her face into the south wind and said, in a voice she kept very level, that the wind had a tone she did not like. She had been a girl in a hard Norwegian winter, and she said she thought there was something in the territory's breathing that reminded her of that. I did not dismiss her. I went into the structure that night and counted my wood and my lamp oil and my dried stores, and I found them short. And I spent the next 6 weeks cutting wood and carrying it in and stacking it along the rear wall of the main room until the stack was ceiling high and 8 feet across. And I packed new grass into the section of the north wall I'd always planned to improve, and I reinforced the roof mound with fresh clay along the drainage ridges. Fern watched all of this from her place near the entrance, her head on her paws. Guard Holt saw me loading wood at Dunham's in December and said, in his easy voice, that it looked like the girl was stocking her grave for a long stay. It was the 3rd time he had used that name in public, and a different place each time, and the 2 men with him laughed, and I loaded my wood and drove home in the early dark. The sky on the morning of January the 9th, 1888 was the color of iron, not gray, not the soft overcast of ordinary winter. Iron, flat and close, with a particular stillness below it that the old Norwegian settlers called the wait and quiet. The temperature at dawn was 8 degrees above zero, which was cold but not remarkable for January. Rue Olson's words from the previous autumn had stayed somewhere at the back of my mind all winter, like a stone placed in a pocket, and I felt for it when I looked at that sky, and my hands knew what to do before my mind said anything. I filled every vessel I had with water. I brought Fern inside and closed the entrance boards and banked the fire and checked the ventilation notches and sat down to wait. The storm arrived at noon, not gradually. One moment the territory was still, and the next the sound began at the edge of hearing and grew in 4 minutes to a roar that shook the grass above the roof and pressed against the entrance boards with both hands. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 2 hours. By 3 in the afternoon, it was 32 below zero outside, falling, and the wind was carrying a horizontal snow that had no space between its particles and no mercy in its direction. And the territory that day became a place that wanted very much to kill everyone in it. I know what it did to the frame houses, because they told me later. Carl Gruber's house. The packed mud chinking between his boards froze solid in the first hour, and then cracked outward as the boards contracted, and the gaps that opened were wide enough to see daylight through, and the cold moved in through those gaps the way water moves through a broken levee, steady and comprehensive, and without stopping. By 5 that evening, he had burned through half his remaining wood, and the room temperature had fallen to 22 degrees. His wife had both children pressed against her on the bed under every blanket they owned, and she held the youngest between her body and the wall to keep the child from the cold radiating off the boards. 3 miles west of them, August Pell burned his last wood by midnight and broke up his kitchen chairs and then the kitchen table, and still the temperature in his house fell, and he and his wife covered themselves in straw from the barn floor and survived the night at 4 degrees inside their own home, which is to say 4 degrees colder than the frost line in a root cellar. And it is a thing that ought not to be possible in a house a man had built for his family. 2 men died that night in Hayes County. One was found the next morning 20 yards from his own barn door in 6 feet of drifted snow. He had gone out for wood, and the white dark had taken his direction, and he had walked the wrong way and not found anything to walk back to. The other died in his house, which surprised people for years afterward, until they understood what his house had not been able to do. What my house was doing on the night of January the 9th was holding. The earth above the roof was 3 feet of layered material, and it had been absorbing solar heat through months of south-facing exposure, and it gave that heat back slowly, the way the earth always does, without drama, without combustion, as a matter of physics. The 2 sod walls with their packed grass between them gave the cold nothing to move through at a useful speed. The room temperature at 10 in the evening, when the storm was at its worst, and the wind was pressing the entrance board so hard that the hinges flexed, was 38 degrees, with the fire banked low, a careful burn. Fern lay on the stone floor near the hearth with her muzzle on her paws and her eyes half closed, and her warmth was part of it too, small and regular and steady. They began arriving at midnight. I heard the sound at the entrance before I heard the knock. A scraping, a body against the boards, and I opened the boards and the storm came in with Carl Gruber and his wife and both children, carrying 2 blankets and nothing else, having walked a quarter-mile through the dark with the children bundled against their chests. They came through the entrance and the door closed behind them, and Carl Gruber stood in the room with his face covered in ice and frost on his brows, and said nothing for a moment. He looked at the walls and at the fire and at the ceiling above him, where the frost that had been building all evening on his own walls and ceiling was entirely absent. And he put his hand flat on the inner sod wall and left it there. Delia Marsh's parents arrived an hour later, guided by a lamp I'd hung outside the entrance when the first family came, and they brought their 3 children and a side of cured pork, and they stood in the room with expressions I did not have words for then, and do not have better ones for now. Rue Olson arrived before dawn, alone, calm as always, with a pot and a bag of dried beans, and she looked at me for a moment before she said anything, and I saw in her face something that was not surprise. By morning, there were 9 of us in the main room and the small side room, and the temperature inside had not fallen below 34 degrees. 9 people and 1 dog, and the fire banked carefully and fed twice in the night. And outside the temperature was 28 below zero, and the storm showed no sign of ending. 4 families whole and sheltered, which was not what anyone had predicted for the girl's grave. Guard Holt came at 7 in the morning. He came alone. He had walked from his place south of town with his coat buttoned to the throat and ice in his mustache, and I heard him against the boards and opened them, and he came inside and stood in the entrance passage looking at the room, at the people in it, at the walls, at the ceiling, at Fern lifting her head from the floor. He stood there for a long time, with his hand on the entrance frame. The room was full of quiet breathing, and the smell of coffee roux had begun, and the low light of the banked fire, and outside the storm pushed at the boards behind him. He put his hand flat on the inner sod wall the same way Carl Gruber had done the night before. He held it there. Then he turned and looked at me. I did not say anything. I did not need to, he said. I did not know a hill could hold this. That was all he said. He sat down on the stone bench along the west wall and pulled off his ice-stiffened gloves and held them in his lap. And the room held him like it held everyone else, without ceremony, without remark, the same 38 degrees it had been holding all night. The storm broke on the evening of January 11th. The families went back to their own places in the gray thaw, and Fern and I were alone again in the room with the fire, and the tin box on its shelf, and the stack of wood still more than half full against the rear wall. And I sat on the floor with my back against the inner sod wall, and felt the steady, unremarkable warmth of the earth behind it. Gran Hetty's warmth. The warmth she had drawn in cross-section on a sheet of paper and left in a bent tin box for someone with hands that would remember what the drawings described. I did not gloat. I did not go to Dunham's store and stand outside and say what I might have said. The catastrophe had said it, and its arithmetic was plain. 2 men dead, 5 households burned through their fuel or close to it, damage to roofs and chinking that would cost the spring to repair. 1 household sheltered 9 people through the worst night in the territory's memory, burning less than a cord of wood across the whole storm, holding 38 degrees at the floor when the world outside was 28 below. These are the numbers. They do not require commentary. Ward, the surveyor, came back through Hayes County in the spring of 1888, recording storm damage for the Territorial Homestead Office, and he rode up to my hill and looked at it for a long time, and then pulled out a different ledger than the one he had used before. He asked me to explain the construction, and I did. And he drew as I described, and he asked me to show him the wall cross-section, and I brought out Gran Hetty's tin box and laid her drawings on the wooden table I had built against the south wall, and he copied them carefully into his ledger while the south window light fell across the paper. He wrote above the copy, in his surveyor's hand, sod double wall construction with grass insulation, Hayes County, Nebraska Territory, 1888. He wrote the name below it, Hetty Strand Method, and under that, recorded from her granddaughter, Nora Strand, who proved it in practice in the winter of that year. The method moved through the territory the way knowledge moves when it has been proven in a way that cannot be argued with. Not all at once. Not perfectly. Some of those who built from it in the following years copied the visible form without understanding the principle, setting 2 sod walls close together without packing the gap, or packing it carelessly, or building a south-facing slope into the hill without understanding why the angle mattered. And those houses were better than standard frame, but not as good as they could have been. And that is the nature of inherited knowledge when it travels too fast, through hands that have not yet learned to feel the difference, but those who sat with me and asked careful questions, who stayed in the room long enough to understand that the warmth was not the fire's doing but the walls. They built right, and their houses held. Rue Olson's 2 daughters built their own houses that summer, with my help, and they understood the principle and not just the form, and both structures stood for decades and sheltered children and grandchildren across winters that would have defeated the frame houses those children were too young to remember. Guard Holt rebuilt his own place the summer of '88, standard frame, which was his right and his choice, and he did not mock the method again. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had been very certain for a long time, and was now at 52 years old, learning what it felt like to have been wrong about something that mattered. He came by my place that summer with a bottle of preserves his wife had put up, and he set them on my stone bench and did not say much. And I thanked him for them, and that was the extent of it. And it was enough. The structure stood for 30 years. I know because I counted. I left the Hayes County claim in 1904 to follow my own life elsewhere, and the hill and the room went with the land to a family named Carr who had come down from the Dakotas, and they used the main room as a cold cellar and the side room for storing grain. And the Carr daughter who grew up on that land told people about it when she was old, told them a woman had built it by hand when she was 16 and alone, and how it had sheltered 9 people in the worst storm the territory had ever known. She was not certain she had the details right, and some of what she told she had guessed at, and some she had right. She had the hill right. The hill was still there. In the spring when the snow came off, the mound of earth and sod over the roof turned green along its ridges before the surrounding grass did, because 3 feet of layered earth holds heat longer than the flat ground beside it, and the grass roots that had grown down into it over the decades had learned to expect that warmth and arrived earlier for it. A person riding across that land in late March with the ground still showing frost at its edges, and the sky still the pewter gray of a territory not yet ready to release the cold, would see a green shape rising from the hillside ahead of everything around it, holding summer before summer arrived, the way a thing built right holds what it is meant to hold, long after the hands that built it have gone to other work. That is what Gran Hetty made. Not a room, a principle. The cold cannot pass through what it cannot find. The knowledge does not die when the hands that held it do. It travels, imperfect sometimes, true at its center, carried forward by people who were willing to learn from someone the world had decided not to keep. The hill still holds its green in March,